Right, so you guys are not going to believe this, okay?
Yeah.
Canada, March 23rd, 2025. We've got a newly appointed prime minister. Brand new prime minister, Mark Carney. And he is barely a week into the job.
Yeah.
9 days to be exact.
Wow.
And he calls a surprise election.
Just like that.
Just like that, snaps his fingers, and boom, federal election for April 28th. So that's the rabbit hole we're diving into today. It's being called the Nepean Gambit.
It's fascinating right from the start how these different threads are woven together. You've got this immediate dissolution of parliament. It's a move that really seems to avoid an early confrontation with conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. And then the really intriguing part is this controversy that's surrounding Carney deciding to run in the Nepean riding.
Right. And, think about even how we got here. So last year we saw Justin Trudeau's approval just completely bottomed out, right? Down to 16% in January, which led to him stepping aside.
16%.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then this move that kind of seemed to come out of left field, Carney, who had never actually run for office before in his life, he becomes the new Liberal leader on March 9th. And almost instantly, because of the way our system works, he's prime minister. And then wham, an election is called with him running in Nepean.
You couldn't write this stuff.
It's wild.
It's like a movie or something.
It's a lot to process.
If we can connect this to the bigger picture a little bit, you've also got these significant external forces that are at play here. The renewed threat of tariffs from Donald Trump is hanging over everything, and inevitably, Carney's extensive background in finance, that's going to come under scrutiny. And then on top of all of that, you've got the local reaction in Nepean itself. All these threads, they're really adding another layer of complexity to this whole situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we want to do in this deep dive is really get to the heart of this, right? Why the sudden election? What's the story with Nepean? What are the different perspectives we're hearing from the political parties and from the people who live in Nepean? And ultimately, what could this all mean for Canadian democracy? We're going to be looking very closely at all of the information that we have. So let's just jump right in.
The key question right off the bat is how do we end up with a prime minister who has never even run in an election before, calling an election so quickly? I mean, the timeline itself is just remarkable, right? Trudeau resigns in January with these abysmal approval numbers. And then in less than 2 months, by March 9th, Carney is the new Liberal leader and boom, almost immediately becomes the prime minister. It really highlights for you the speed at which these political shifts can happen.
It really does. And I think it's really important to remember, Carney has zero experience as an elected official before finding himself, thrust into the top job. His background is finance. It's not really the world of electoral politics.
Yeah.
So to remind you, he was the governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013. Then he went on to be the governor of the Bank of England until 2020. Came back to Ottawa in 2020, lives in, that rather upscale Rockcliffe Park area, which is notably not Nepean. And he's been advising Trudeau on economic and climate issues. So he has an impressive resume, but it is not the typical path to becoming the Prime Minister of Canada.
And that lack of direct electoral experience becomes particularly significant when we look at what's been happening in Nepean. We had a sitting Liberal MP, Chandra Arya, who was basically removed as the candidate. On March 20th, the party's Greenlight Committee, so for those of you who don't know, this is generally the body within a political party that vets and approves potential candidates. They revoked his candidacy. They sent him a letter citing new information, but they offered no specifics whatsoever as to what that new information was.
And it was a pretty abrupt move for Arya. He'd represented Nepean since 2015, won 3 consecutive elections there. He put out a Facebook post expressing his disappointment, and I mean, understandably so, but he maintained, a pretty professional tone. He acknowledges his years of service, but it does leave you wondering, right? What could this new information be that leads to such a sudden and dramatic removal?
It really does, and the whole situation becomes even more interesting for you when you consider that just a couple of months before this, Arya was reportedly blocked from even running in the Liberal leadership race.
Oh, wow.
Because he didn't believe that French fluency should be a mandatory requirement for the leader. So it's a curious development in this whole saga.
It really is.
Now, what's also quite interesting is how Carney is trying to establish a connection with Nepean. He's making these claims of knowing the area really well. He mentions that he was the best man for Peter Chiarelli, who's a well-known figure in local hockey, and that he's familiar with the area from Barrhaven all the way to Bell's Corners. It almost feels a bit like rushed, doesn't it? Almost like he's trying to build up this local credibility very quickly.
It does feel very sudden, doesn't it? And then you see these campaign videos that he's putting out, that video of him skating with the Edmonton Oilers, and he's wearing the number 24 jersey, which seems like, a very deliberate nod to him potentially becoming Canada's 24th prime minister. It all feels very polished and very strategic.
Very.
He's even describing Nepean, with its median income of around $50,400 and its diverse population, as a microcosm of Canada.
Hmm.
So he's really trying to tie himself to this riding and to the people who live there. His main focus in these early campaign appearances, though, seems to be on the threat of Trump's 25% tariffs. He keeps emphasizing this message of, you know, Canada can't control what happens in the U.S., but we can control our response.
It's a classic strong leader narrative, isn't it?
Exactly. And then we have to talk about his policy proposals. This is where it gets really interesting. He's talking about retaliatory tariffs if Trump goes ahead with these 25% tariffs. He's talking about improvements to infrastructure. He's talking about an expansion of dental care, all really significant promises. But as you pointed out, the specific details at this early stage, they're noticeably absent.
Yeah, they are.
And it's important to note, to give our listeners some local context, that Nepean historically has been a riding that leans liberal. Beryl Gaffney held the seat for the Liberals for almost a decade in the late 90s, and then, Arya has been winning there since 2015. So they're not just, dropping a new candidate into a totally unwelcoming riding.
That's an important point. But there's also a question that arises for you. While there might be parallels to situations like when Pierre Trudeau ran in Mount Royal or Michael Ignatieff in Etobicoke Lakeshore, where we see these high-profile leaders running in specific ridings, the Nepean situation feels a bit different. In those previous cases, the seats were either largely open or the previous representation wasn't as long-standing as Arya.
Yeah.
He was a sitting MP and he was successful. The lack of a clear reason for his removal really makes this stand out, and I think for the listener, it raises the significant question. What kind of message does this send to local party organizations and to the voters that they represent?
It does make you think about who really has the power in these situations, and I think it's really interesting for us to look at what the broader political strategy at play seems to be here. So, from what we've seen, what is the Liberal approach with this move?
Well, the most obvious element is that they're really trying to position Carney as a strong, experienced leader who can navigate let's face it, the potential economic challenges that might be coming from a rather volatile Trump administration.
Yeah.
And you can already see an immediate reaction in public opinion polls. We're seeing reports of this huge jump from 16% support under Trudeau to a 42-36 lead over the Conservatives. Now, that's a significant shift. And we've even seen some endorsements from within the Liberal Party. Jenna Sudds, for example, who's the MP for the neighboring riding of Kanata-Carleton, she's publicly come out in support of Carney, really highlighting his ability to, in her words, handle difficult situations and stand up to the U.S.
And that's pretty significant coming from another MP.
Yeah.
But what I think is really surprising is the way that Carney seems to have shifted some of his policy positions. He's now advocating for some things that sound very similar to what the Conservatives have been proposing, which is kind of interesting. Cutting income tax for lower earners, there's been specific mention of a 1% cut for individuals earning up to, I think it's around $57,000.
Right.
They're saying that could save a two-income household something like $800. And he's also talking about eliminating the carbon tax, canceling that planned increase to capital gains tax, even things like putting limits on immigration levels. So this is a pretty significant departure from typical liberal policy platform.
It's a big shift.
It is. It almost feels like they're trying to, kind of preemptively address some of the key criticisms that the Conservatives have been leveling at them. But for you, the listener, the question is, how convincing is this?
Yeah.
I mean, Carney's defense for all of these moves initially seems to just revolve around those first 9 days. He keeps mentioning the potential for tariff retaliation. He's outlining these vague infrastructure plans. But from what we've seen reported, he hasn't actually confronted Trump directly yet.
Right.
So that's going to be interesting to see how that unfolds.
And that's where the conservative counter-strategy comes in. Poilievre launched his Bring It Home campaign on the very same day that Carney called this election. Now, he had been enjoying a really strong lead in the polls before Trudeau resigned, so now he's in this position where he needs to catch up. And you can tell that he's been thrown a bit by these rapid changes in the political landscape and, just the unpredictability of Trump. His central message at his campaign launch, which he held in Barrhaven, which is right next to Nepean, by the way, was really focused on, in his words, the need to avoid a fourth consecutive Liberal term. So he's really hitting home on these themes of taxation, Canada's sort of weakening position in relation to the United States.
Right, right. And he's certainly not mincing words when it comes to his criticism of Carney. He's calling him a sneaky Trudeau clone.
Hmm.
So the Conservatives are really trying to hammer home this point, that despite these apparent policy shifts, Carney really just represents more of the same.
Exactly. And they're also going after what they see as inconsistencies in Carney's record. They're pointing to past statements that he's made, like in his 2021 book, where he seems to argue for leaving a significant portion of fossil fuels untouched.
Right.
They're contrasting that with his current support for a more streamlined one-window system for energy project approvals. And then you've got the carbon tax issue, where Carney's proposing a cut, but Poilievre wants a full repeal. So it's all part of this conservative effort to really try to paint Carney as inauthentic, as an opportunist in your eyes as the voter.
So when you step back and you consider this whole situation, I think that the Nepean switch really shines a light on this fundamental tension that we have within our democracy.
Yeah.
Right? It's the power that political parties have versus the agency of local voters and their elected representatives.
Yeah.
I think this is something for our listeners to really think about. When a party can seemingly parachute in a leader like this into a specific riding, it does make you wonder about the implications for the democratic process at the local level.
Absolutely. And I think for you, the listener, there are still some unanswered questions here. Carney's extensive financial history from his time in the banking sector is something that's definitely going to face more scrutiny as the campaign progresses.
For sure.
And his position on climate change in the long term, I think, beyond just this immediate political messaging, is something that remains a little unclear, especially given some of his past ratings.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And Poilievre is already kind of seizing on some of these ambiguities. His criticisms of Carney's proposed cap on immigration, especially when you consider that in the context of the housing shortages that we already have, I think that's a message that is probably going to resonate with a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's that somewhat pointed remark about, needing to truly understand Canada. He even made a reference to, like, Mr. Dressup's puppets, which I thought was pretty funny. But I think that's a direct jab at Carney, right? He's only been back in Canada for a few years. He's got this much more international background. So Poilievre is really trying to make that a point of contrast between the two of them.
So we come back to these central questions that we started with, right? Is this whole Nepean gambit a desperate gamble by the Liberals, or is it a really clever strategic move? And I think regardless of how it turns out, the situation tells us something about the health and the state of Canadian democracy in 2025. Nepean, this suburban riding in Ottawa, has suddenly become a huge battleground in this election.
It's wild.
It's where these big questions about leadership, about representation, about national identity, they're all being fiercely contested. So it's a riding that now carries a lot of weight for you as we head into this election.
All right. So just to kind of recap for everyone listening, the Nepean Gambit is this rapid sequence of events. You have the unexpected election call just days after Carney becomes prime minister. Then you have his, let's call it controversial, decision to run in Nepean, following Arya's rather surprising removal. And then we're seeing these really distinct and different strategies that are being employed by the Liberals under this brand new leadership and the Conservatives as they try to regain their footing.
It's really compelling you to think about the implications of this kind of political maneuvering, right?
Mm.
What does it really mean for local representation when a party leader can just so decisively alter the electoral landscape like this? It really raises important questions for you about the balance of power that exists within our political parties, and the relationship that they ultimately have with the voters that they're trying to represent.
I think that's a great way to sum it up. And finally, here's something for everyone to kind of chew on, after our deep dive today. With the election just a few weeks away, April 28th, and, the outcome is really far from certain at this point. What is this intense focus on a single riding and these incredibly rapid shifts in the political landscape tell us about where we are in Canadian politics right now? What are those key factors that are really going to influence how people vote in this election? And is this idea of Nepean as a microcosm? Is it truly representative of the priorities and the concerns of the wider Canadian electorate? I think it's going to be a very interesting few weeks to watch.
Couldn't agree more. This one's going to be a nail-biter.
Absolutely. All right, thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll be back soon to, hopefully make sense of whatever happens next.
Sounds good.
See you next time.
There is so much more to do to secure Canada, to invest in Canada, to build Canada, to unite Canada. That's why I'm asking for a strong, positive mandate from my fellow Canadians. I have just requested that the Governor-General dissolve Parliament and call an election for April 28th. And she has agreed. We are facing the most significant crisis of our lifetimes because of President Trump's unjustified trade actions and his threats to our sovereignty. Our response must be to build a strong economy and a more secure Canada. President Trump claims that Canada isn't a real country. He wants to break us so America can own us. We will not let that happen.